My name is Nataliya Deleva, and I have the pleasure of being the executive director of Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. For those of you who are new to our work, you might want to know that we connect the Anglosphere and Bulgaria through literature, creative writing, translation, and cross exposures like the one today, spanning across borders and literary cultures. Welcome to the virtual stage of CapitaLiterature program, one of our annual programs that normally takes place in Sozopol. In Sofia, but following the acclaimed Sozopol fiction seminars. As you might know, the focal theme of this year's edition is writers and influences, and it invites contemporary writers to present their literary influences, contemporary or not. Today's event follows presentations by Colm Toybin, Colm McCann, Jeffrey Eugenides, Dimitar Kenarov, and Benjamin Moser. And here we go. It's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Nataliya Deleva. No kinship with me. Nataliya's debut novel, 4 Minutes, was originally published in Bulgaria back in 2017. Thank you, chat. And enjoyed critical acclaim immediately after its release. The book was awarded Best Debut Novel and was shortlisted for Novel of the Year and has since been translated into several languages, including English, published by Open Letter, German, and Polish. Nataliya's short fiction, book reviews, and essays have appeared in Words Without Borders, Fans, Asymptote, Empty Mirror, and Granta, Bulgaria, among others. Her second novel, Arrival, written in English, is forthcoming from Indigo Press in UK next year. Our moderator today is Chad Post. He is the publisher of Open Letter books at the University of Rochester, a nonprofit press dedicated to publishing literature in translation, but it does more than publishing. The press is at the center of an ecosystem that creates appetite for literature in translation, actually. And in his role as its director, Chad has initiated important projects like 3% blog, the translation database, and the Best Translation Book Awards. He received the Words Without Borders 2018 Ottaway Award for his extraordinary steps to advance literature in translation in the United States. Open Letter is sometimes called the Bulgarian publisher in America, perhaps because Open Letter Books and the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation co-run two programs initiated by the foundation back in 2010. One is a contest resulting in publication of Bulgarian novel, and the other one is translation fellowship for Bulgarian translator to spend time at Open Letter Books. Open Letter is the publisher of Nataliya's debut novel, 4 Minutes, supported within the program I mentioned. Also, he is the publisher of Dubravka, Ugrešić, the subject of today's presentation. At least 6 of Ugrešić books have been published by Open Letter, if I remember correctly. So, Chad seems very well placed to converse with Nataliya Deleva about Dubravka, Ugrešić. Before I turn it over to Chad, a very brief rundown of the event. If you are watching us from the live stream on Facebook, and if you need translation into Bulgarian, please join this Zoom webinar, because only the original audio will be projected on Facebook. And we will post the registration link briefly. Chat, I have to say that in Bulgarian, but I'll be back, I promise. Ако ни гледате във Facebook и имате нужда от превод на български, моля присъединете се към вебинара, за да може да се възползвате от превода от английски на български. Following the moderated conversation, we'll love to hear from you. You can do so in Facebook or here using the Q&A. To ask questions, and we will hope that there will be time left. Many thanks to our interpreters, Bistra and Martin. Also would like to thank the support of the United States Embassy in Bulgaria and Sofia Municipality. Chat, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for watching. And I guess the floor is mine, but really, Nataliya, you're going to be giving us a good introduction as to how Dubravka has influenced your work. So maybe I should just turn it right over to you and give you the floor.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the introduction, both Chad and Milena. It's a really great pleasure for me to talk about Dubravka Ugrešić. She has really influenced my writing. The first time I stumbled upon Dubravka Ugrešić's writing was by coming across an article about her book, Maritime Fictionary. It was in a brand new kind of radical magazine for its time in Bulgaria called PS. And they are defining itself as a magazine about gender equality and feminism. It was the late 1999, the edge of the new century. And for me, reading an article about Ugrešić, actually kind of her essay in that magazine, filled me with joy and excitement, because in my hand I was holding a piece of writing that was both really exciting and kind of forward-thinking, but also somehow feeling homey and kind of in a way familiar. It was an essay about the Balkan macho and the way women are perceived and kind of treated by men in a Balkan society. You know, all kind of the stereotypes that were placed on women. We are raised in communities, to kind of live in communities during the communism. We were supposed to be kind of caring and nurturing, you know, kind and gentle, kind of despite being exhausted, looking after the home and the kids, but also working alongside men, and also working alongside men, but then also not striving to have a career. The essay were also kind of exploring thoughts about how we were raised to be, in a way, superhumans, I would say, in countries which were led by men, you know, working in the companies that were managed by men. You know, the books on our shelves were written mostly by men. So I marveled at this Ugrešić's view, and although the concept of, you know, feminism might not have been anything new to the Western society at the time, it did feel quite controversial for that time in Bulgaria, and I would say that, you know, so many years later, kind of the idea around gender identity might still feel a bit controversial to some people in Bulgaria, which is interesting for me. But this is something that influenced my writing a lot. You know, I kind of stumbled across this essay, you know, so many years ago. But next year, as Milena mentioned, my book Arrival will be published, which explores the same questions of gender roles, expectations placed on women in the post-communist Eastern European society. So going back to the essay, the very next day, I ran to my favorite bookshop in Sofia. At the time, I was still living in Sofia. I bought the book. It was wrapped really carefully and kind of given to me as it was a treasure. And it was really a treasure. So that was the first book that I got from Dubravka Ugrešić. It's in Bulgarian. In English, it's called Maritime Fictionary. I have to say that initially, I think it was published as Have a Nice Day. Now it's published by Open Letter as Maritime Fictionary. I think the title is just, you know, so much better. I think it kind of reflects on what the book is about. And the book is a collection of essays. They're arranged as a sort of a dictionary. Each essay is titled by an English word, and it's reflecting on the American culture and everyday life through the eyes of a newcomer, a foreigner who had just lost their country, and kind of trying to reassemble the meaning of self, of otherness, of identity, or kind of loss of identity. And disappearance. The parallels often that she draws upon often reveal an abyss between the well-organized and the well-arranged American life and the life that is completely doesn't exist in former Yugoslavia. You know, kind of the destruction that was caused by the war at the time, and yet this is not obviously an ordinary dictionary, as the title implies, fictionary. The essays are an exploration of reality both existent in America and non-existent in former Yugoslavia. And I found this list, or kind of organized as a form for this book, not just intriguing, but really necessary. I was kind of fascinated by the way these essays were arranged, and I later discovered that other books by Ugrešić are also using that kind of idea, well, not idea, but kind of the form of a list, or that fragmentation as a literary form, which again is something very necessary. Now I'll explain why in a bit, but this is something that I employ in my writing as well. So for example, 4 minutes is quite fragmented as a form, and I use a very similar style in Arrival as well. I'll kind of try to organize my thoughts also in a similar way of kind of clusters of topics that she renders in her writing. And the first one, we can not start with that one, is trauma. Rilke says that a broken life can be told only in fragments. And in this respect, in a way, trauma could be perceived as a literary form itself. Generally speaking, healing a trauma requires going back to the past, ideally with the help of a therapist. And in her book, The Ministry of Pain, which I read, I think in 2005, it was just a few months after I arrived in London and kind of trying to settle in. The book resonated with me really, really deeply. The narrator of the book is a lecturer in Serbo-Croatian in Amsterdam University. And she tries to keep alive the memory of the kind of the Yugo nostalgia, the memory of the former Yugoslavia in her students, who are also emigrants from Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia. And she's trying to do this while the country itself, as well as the narrator's own world, collapses. Her name, the lecturer's name is Tanja Lucic. I think that's kind of the right pronunciation in English. And she invents an imaginary memory bag where she and her students collate trivia from their past. Kind of in that way, they're sort of reliving the past traumatic events. They're re-exposing the wounds in order to heal. And these imaginary objects are given second life, I would say, whether they are, for example, recipes from traditional dishes like the Bosnian Ugrešić or hot pot, or the memory of the first ever dance at school. And these memories are awakened during the kind of improvised lectures come sessions. I can call them that way because I think Tanja Lucic herself takes, or kind of is seen to take, that kind of a role almost as a therapist in these sessions. And some of these memories are transformed, they're changed, some of them are even made up in order to replace kind of the longing for the former life of the characters in the former country. The protagonists lean on this memorabilia from their former country as if they're crutches. And trauma is something that I explore in both of my novels, although the traumatic events are different. The protagonist in 4 minutes grows up in a care home during the communism and early years of post-communism, and she's dreaming up her mother. She's imagining what her life would have been if she had a family. Her trauma isn't caused by what had happened, but by the experiences and the mothering figure that she never had, that never existed. So she also invents a sort of imaginary treasure chest in a very similar way Ugrešić uses the imaginary treasure bag or box, where she collects non-existent memories of her, about her childhood, recipes of homemade meals that she never tasted, birthday gifts that she never received. The food in my novel, I would say, carries some sort of symbolic meaning and builds bridges to a safe place in a very similar way to how Ugrešić uses references to food in her writing as well. And I think Ugrešić's way of narrating trauma also influenced my second book, Arrival, which depicts the ripple effects of domestic abuse on children. It follows the story of a young woman fleeing her home country and trying to rebuild her life abroad after suffering domestic abuse from her violent alcoholic father. She recollects her past, kind of the scattered pieces of her traumatic childhood in order to process that childhood, to understand and eventually to heal. And while I wouldn't necessarily want to compare the traumas from escaping war and the one kind of scarring a child experiencing domestic violence, although I probably could easily, because in both cases you are afraid of death, really, for yourself and for your loved ones as well. But even if I don't compare them, I think in both novels, the protagonists live in exile. They cross borders in an attempt to escape the past, and the feeling of shame associated with trauma is something that both Ugrešić and I explore in that relation to the traumatic past. I think it's the shame that is engraved over the traumatized mind, the shame that this event has happened to you. And Ugrešić mentions the way that fellow emigrants carry a scar, like an invisible slap on their faces. I really, really like that. She mentioned that. I think it's so true, not just to her characters, but just to a lot of people that are living Eastern Europe and Balkans and living abroad. And that feeling of shame for Ugrešić has a very personal expression, I think. It's something that lingers in her books when she describes how her protagonist made to feel by those that remained on the territory of the former country. She draws on kind of the way that those that had emigrated are perceived when returning back to their families. So while you're abroad, while they are abroad, that kind of the fellow immigrants from former Yugoslavia perceive themselves as ours. They see themselves as a kind of community. However, their loved ones who had remained in the home country can easily see them as others, as the foreigners now living elsewhere. And this often brings a feeling of isolation to her characters, of some sort of living in between space, not belonging to the new country, but also not belonging to their home country in some sense. And that's also something that I touch upon in my book Arrival as well. This is also depicted through the complex relationships between Ugrešić's protagonist and her mother. And let's face it, the mother-daughter relationship could be quite complex outside of the war zone anyway. But in her return to her home, Tanya Lutic is depicted as an outsider of her hometown and even her home as well, to a degree. Her otherness becomes evident in the way that her mother speaks about her in front of neighbors. She is perceived as a survivor of her mother's unhappiness, despite actually never being close to her mother as a child. She's there to repair the house, to fix things out, to mend her mother's world that is collapsing and it's dissolving. And then she leaves again, and her mother keeps her at home through very carefully selected fragments and objects that signify their mother-daughter relationship, and also the presence of the daughter at home when she's physically not there. And there are just a few framed pictures, some old clothes, not too many, just a few items that the mother has decided to keep, as if she's the kind of the director for like an imaginary soap opera that goes on forever. The mother cannot accept that her daughter has left, and this kind of act of collating the memorabilia metaphorically, I think, represents their bond, as almost if that's the umbilical cord that connects a mother and her baby and her daughter. The refugee trauma and the grief can only be compared in this case to the one of an orphan child. And in a similar way, the protagonist of my book, 4 Minutes, Leia, keeps a blanket from the day that she was given for adoption. So that was the first day that she was born. Her mother left her, and the only thing that she keeps from that day and from her mother is a blanket. And that blanket, kind of the thread of the blanket, replaces the umbilical cord in a very similar way. And the link mother-daughter is artificially kept alive through objects that are now imbued with this kind of new meaning. In one case, the recollection of the past. In the other case, in my book, is kind of the recollection of an imaginary life. And the act of keeping something non-existing alive is, in its pure form, an act of substitution, which brings an additional feeling of displacement. And this feeling of displacement in a lot of Ugrešić's books, for her characters, it's expressed through linguistic system or the lack of it. And this is, something that, for example, in her novel, The Ministry of Pain, she describes that she describes the novel as the trauma of the language and the language of trauma. And I would say people experiencing post-traumatic stress, you witness, generally talking, you witness their inability to verbalize the traumatic events. The past is scattered into pieces, and you're just unable to process all these pieces in a linear way, with the beginning, middle, and end. You're trying to find ways to reconstruct, to organize it, but it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to verbalize that. In a very similar way, the students in the Ministry of Pain are often unable to construct their narrative in their home language, as though the language dissolves and kind of disappears along with the redefinition of their home country and with their identity. So the language, or rather the broken syntax of memory, becomes their common trauma. For one of the students, for example, Igor, expressing himself in this new adoptive language means freedom, while he feels that his mother tongue is somehow restrictive and suffocating. And the language itself, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, they change as well. The language is deformed by media, by institutions. It becomes rough and disfigured. And adopting a new language and using it becomes a political statement, a sort of a demonstration of being politically correct. So hence, if you're unwilling to belong to this narrative, you also struggle to adopt the language. It's a layer in this kind of collective trauma, I would say. It's kind of a scar that is too visible to ignore. In my book, 4 Minutes, Dara is a 5-year-old girl that is growing in care, who had witnessed the kind of the brutal murder of her parents. And since then, she has stopped talking. Now she became completely mute. In a very similar way, her trauma has amputated her ability to express herself verbally. because language requires comprehension, ability to construct a reality, which a traumatized mind rejects in order to survive. We are probably, all of us are too familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response to danger. But for Ugrešić's characters, the inability to fully adopt these newish languages, kind of left over from former Yugoslavia, and yet expected to exist and function as separate languages in this post-war reality, is also defined by their unwillingness to accept the political framework of the nation separation and the new geographical split, the physical separation, the nationalism that it's forming at the time. And naturally, for many, the only way to process the new reality is to escape it, both geographically and verbally. So avoiding the language that carries the trauma for her characters is a sort of linguistic migration, I would say. It's another way of living in exile. So let's look at the word exile, really. That's an interesting one. Both American Fictionary and the Ministry of Pain are often described as books about migration and exile. But migration doesn't quite equal exile. The dictionary defines the word exile as the state of being expelled from one's country, and that's typically for political reasons. At the same time, emigration means the act of leaving one's own country to settle in another one. And the difference is not subtle, it's huge in the sense of the reason for moving abroad. One is defined by external pressure or force, and the other one by personal intention. And in this respect, for me, both books, in most of her books that touch upon this are about exile. In her book of essays, Thank You for Not Reading, she wrote one of the advantages of exile. Let me just read that. Exile is the voluntary job of deconstructing the established values of human life. The exile, like it or not, tests the basic concepts around which everyone's life revolves. Concepts of home, homeland, family, love, friendship, profession, personal biography. Having completed the long and arduous journey of battling with the bureaucracy of the country where he has ended up, having finally acquired papers, the exile forgets the secret knowledge he had acquired on his journey in the name of life, which must go on. In the case of the characters of in the Ministry of Pain, things are even more complicated because not only they're forced to move out of their home country, native country, for political or other reasons, their native country ceases to exist. It disappears, dissolves, both from the political and geographical map. And this changes the narrative of their existence. I want to say identity, but I wouldn't, because I know how Dubravka feels about this word, which is very complex, and she doesn't like it very much, especially when it comes to labels, so I'll stay away from it. But I think there is no romance in the act of living in exile, as some people might perceive it, and they're usually people that never experienced that. And I think this is why one of the synonyms of exile is uprooted. You're forcefully uprooted from a place where you believe to belong to, which was your center point, and suddenly you find yourself pushed towards the periphery. The protagonist of my novel Arrival crosses borders and relocates to London in an effort to move further away from the past and to flee her abusive father. And in this case, the migration is both geographical and related to time. She's trying to escape her childhood trauma that happened in the past. But despite being haunted by the terror and kind of the horrifying memories, the reason for her migration stems from her desire to move out and move on. There is no external political pressure in the way that there is in the Ugrešić's books. And yet, finding herself abroad in this new country, the narrator loses her focal point in a very similar way. Her memories disperse before her eyes, and she must assemble them first before she can really build a new life abroad. In the Ministry of Pain, the Ugrešić's narrator feels as if left without a focal point as well, both internal and external as well. She feels vulnerable in this new country where the society paradigm of suffering and disappearing could sometimes even exclude the suffering of people from the Balkans. She goes on to give an example about the disappearing of torches and kind of the empathy that they receive in the media, while the disappearing of a European country and the deaths of thousands of people somehow feel emotionally more distant and difficult to relate to. She says, actually her character, Kukla, in Baba Yaga Laid an Egg, says that invisibility in which we live next to one another is appalling. But I think that invisibility could sometimes become a safe place and offer some sort of protection, as it helps to blend in. Ugrešić mentions the kind of the self-causing amnesias her characters often adopt to numb the pain with forgetfulness. In the Ministry of Pain, she describes how Tanya Lucic returns to her hometown and finds herself lost on the street while she's trying to find a building the building where she can get a new ID card. And that really struck me deeply with the symbolic meaning of this act. As though the building, which is also the place that provides the proofs of the map and from her memory as well. But this is not, I think it kind of, in this amnesia, the subconscious act of unwillingness to remember, it's something that, I was kind of marveling upon, but also the willingness to forget. And I think the refugee trauma, the kind of the equivalent of sudden disappearance of the mother from a child's field, her vision, I think Tanya Lucic notes in the book, Ministry of Pain. She says that she had suffered, that kind of trauma had surfaced where she had least expected it at home. And that was something that influenced a fragment in my book Arrival as well, where I depict a very similar situation where the protagonist returns to her home city and attempts to visit her father's grave. That's the same father who has been physically abusing her for years as a child. And she's unable to locate the grave. She just can't find it. She panics by this memory blanket. And although this is kind of a seemingly random momentary amnesia, it's very much needed to kind of balm the scars, to leave them in the past and not to carry them with her, or at least not to carry the harrowing effects of them into the present. In 4 minutes, the characters are kind of scarred by their invisibility. In most cases, they are people that live on the fringes of society. They represent social groups who exist in the periphery. They're quite often stigmatized. But for Ugrešić's characters, invisibility is, as I said, it's often welcomed. It's the opposite of having to prove your existence or kind of having to open up to the world and to others, especially in those kind of first months, for example, when someone arrives in a new country. I want to read the opening paragraph of the Museum of Unconditional Surrender. I don't speak German, by the way. Ik ben müde, I say to Fred. His sorrowful, pale face stretches into a grin. Ik ben müde is the only German sentence I know at the moment. And right now, I don't want to learn anymore. Learning more means opening up. And I want to stay closed for a while longer. Just an example, really, of that. But there's also the invisibility as an erasure of the painful events and the memories. So, for example, the missing father who Tanya Ugrešić carries with her like an invisible pearl, that's how she describes it. He kills himself when she was little, and her mother completely erases him from their family albums, conversations, in order to protect the daughter from the pain. And yet, the hole that's left clutched between unspoken words and vague recollections of him, it's what makes pain even deeper. And the trauma is the absence of the father. This is very much kind of the seed that inspired my book for a minute, where the trauma is the absence of the mother. And actually, in fact, the book in Bulgarian, if I have to translate it directly, is invisible. And I'd like to finish here with my introduction to Dubravka Ugrešić, and I would like to thank her for writing all these books that I really treasure, and I found really powerful and inspiring. And I would like to open our discussion with chat, and by asking you, chat, how did you come across Dubravka Ugrešić, and why did you decide to start publishing her books?
We didn't plan this, but every note that I wrote down for what to talk about first, you just like led into perfectly. But before that, I do know that Dubravka is in the audience, and Dubravka, if you want to join us for the Q&A, email Melina right now, and she can get you onto the right side of the chat. But if not, that's cool too. No pressure on our part, knowing that you're there. But so you mentioned that you had first come across Dubravka's work in a magazine, and the same thing happened to me. So back in like early 2000s, when I was working at Delki Archive Press, there was an issue of Bomb magazine that had an interview with Dubravka about a book that she had written called Thank You for Not Reading, that couldn't find a publisher, and that was like aggressively like kind of critiquing the entire publishing industry, the art, the way that books get produced, which ones get valued and promoted and which ones don't, and how difficult it can be if you're working from a language, a smaller language, and especially if you're working from a smaller language as a female. So
as a woman, yeah,
as a woman. And I read that essay or the interview and was like, this sounds amazing. This sounds like exactly the sort of author that we should be promoting and that I would really like. And we happen to have like the Museum of Unconditional Surrender in the office. So I read that like basically that night, got in touch with the people at BOM, ended up getting in touch with Dubravka, ended up making Thank You for Not Reading, the first book that I worked on with her that was published by Delki. And interestingly enough, we are reissuing as an open letter book in January of next year. So we're in the process of actually rereading that and cleaning it up and so on and so forth. And you asked why I wanted to keep publishing her. And one thing that came to me as you were talking is that we're talking about like writers and influences and like the influence that she's had on your work. And in a way, she's an influence on me as a publisher too. Like the way that taking Thank You for Not Reading as a starting point, the way that she looks at the lens to which she looks at the publishing world, the business side of it, the like inequities of it, the way that it functions is always, it really strikes home to me and is something that I really value. And the way that she's committed to art as like a sort of formalist perspective and a way of using language and form to like create something that's new and unique and that might not fit into like the conventional, most popular sort of way of writing at that moment in time, but is committed to something that is bigger than that and is more interesting than that, both in terms of her fiction, like with Fox, which was the last fiction work that we did a couple of years ago, and with the nonfiction like Karaoke Culture or Europe and Sepia, or more recently Age of Skin, which I think I have here. In both of those, like her commitment to art and to writing and to expressing things is like so moving to me, and it's something that feels very powerful and something that I feel honored to be able to bring to a larger audience and want to remain and keep that. Like it influences me in thinking about other books that we would publish and other things that we would work on, that it should be of that sort of direct honesty. I think that sort of answers your question. The other funny thing is I can't find it, but for thank you for not reading, the cover on the Delphi book is this postcard that she sent me. Oh, there it is. This one, like about 2 years ago, I just saved. So she had sent this as a postcard. We ended up making that the cover for the Delphi version of Thank You for Not Reading. So it's interesting to first meet people through like articles and postcards in this sort of way that we don't even really do that so much anymore. It's all digital.
Yes,
is amazing.
Say that, but it's an interesting kind of thing. When I first arrived in London and I was reading The Ministry of Pain, I was just so fascinated by the book. It just resonated with me so deeply. Again, very different reasons for kind of moving abroad, you know, what she describes in the book and my personal reasons. I was not pushed away from Bulgaria. I was not kind of made to, you know, to take that decision. There were completely different reasons for me, not economical, not political. And yet the book resonated really strongly. So I was 20 something and I found Dubravka's email. I emailed her just, you know, saying, even now I blush when I think about it, but, you know, I was kind of explaining how much I value her, you know, her writing, and never even thought that she replied to me, but she did. And like 16, 17 years later, I still keep that email and hoping that Google never deletes it. But that kind of, it's almost kind of, you know, collecting that memorabilia of something that sounds home, that sounds familiar and make you feel, you know, make you, you know, kind of help you to survive, I guess, in this kind of new environment. It's so familiar. So I think the only book that I don't have is The Age of Skin. I've been kind of, you know, collecting every single one that, you know, I can find, you know, I can order in whether Bulgarian or English, and this has really been a kind of a great safe place for me to go to every time. Yeah. But there was something interesting what you're saying, how she influenced you as a publisher. But I was really wondering, obviously for me, I feel really connected to the books, finding different bridges in a way to connect to her writing. You know, she makes, you know, she uses, for example, you know, a lot of kind of mythology, you know, figures from mythology, kind of Slavic culture, like Baba Yaga, for example, and they make sense to me because I'm too familiar with that. And there are a lot of other kind of symbols that she uses, and obviously she talks about Balkan culture, which again is too familiar to me, in the whole kind of idea of how you're perceived from the outside world. But how do you read her, and how do you kind of read all these kind of symbols? How do you perceive these kind of, you know, her whole kind of writing? Because before you kind of answering the question, I mentioned earlier that, you know, she doesn't like the word identity and kind of being labeled, and I completely agree with her. Even when I was thinking, how do I introduce her? I really don't want to say that she's a Croatian writer, because is she? You know, is she post kind of former Yugoslavia writer? Is she a European writer? For me, she's a writer, and she's an amazing writer, and I don't need to know more about it. I don't need to classify her. But, you know, reading her books, how do you classify her? How would you describe her, and what do you find interesting?
That's really funny, because I was going to ask you a similar question, in that she is the only author in our catalog. All of our authors have like their country of origin affiliated with them in like places where you can search and find, like all the Bulgarian authors are in one page on our website, or like in the back of the catalog, or it's referenced in various places, except for Dubravka. Hers is European. It is just European. Yeah, own place, own category, which is perfectly fine and perfectly reasonable because, like you say, like the labeling, the sort of leads to like a nationalism, leads to like all sorts of other problems that she's very conscious of and very aware of. And I was going to ask you, I have answer to your question, but I was going to ask you how you felt about that in the sense that you've switched, your quote unquote a Bulgarian writer, but you're not writing in Bulgarian anymore. And how that, if that was a political choice of yours or a choice of like, what influenced you to make that decision? And does that alter the way you think about yourself as a writer? Do you feel more like just a writer now and less of a categorized writer?
In my case, there was no political kind of reason for that at all. I actually started writing Arrival, kind of attempted to write Arrival in Bulgarian first. And I started writing everything, because it kind of splits in two different kind of almost parallel lines. One is flashbacks about the childhood, which happens in Bulgaria, and the kind of the present, which takes place in the UK. And while I was writing about the past, about the events that happened in Bulgaria, it was easy to write in Bulgarian. But when I moved on to write about the kind of the fragments and the chapters that take place in the UK, I just couldn't continue at all. So I paused and I stayed there for about 6 months. I was not able to write a single word because it wouldn't just come naturally to me. It was almost unnatural to write about an English reality in a different language. So I attempted to start writing in English, and it happened, and it was just so natural that I then had to go back and rewrite about the Bulgarian bits, in English. And again, rewriting, not translating, because I don't think that's possible for me as well. So the way that I would describe myself, I mean, again, I don't really want to kind of describe, but I always say that I'm Bulgarian born. And I don't want to kind of push on any nationalism or, to be patriotic. I mean, I don't really like this whole kind of, wave of, the way people are feeling about it, all kind of the proud because you are born in a country where you effectively have nothing to do with the fact that you're born here or there or somewhere else. There's no reason to be ashamed. There's no reason to be proud of. So I kind of stay away from these influences, really. I don't really like to touch. But the way that I feel is, although I've been living in the UK for the last 16, 17 years, I do kind of carry that kind of my Bulgarian culture with me. I want my children to, to be able to speak and write in Bulgarian, to go back there and be able to converse with our friends and relatives, and just to kind of know where their parents are coming from. That doesn't necessarily mean that my kids are going to feel Bulgarian, but that's just kind of the nature of it. And there is something else as well, in terms of, there are so many ways that a writer can describe themselves or be labeled by others, female writer versus male writer, this or that. And I don't really want to kind of fall into any of these, as in being described as female writer or writer for women audiences, kind of female audiences, because again, you never describe the male writer as a male writer, right? They're writers, and then also they're the female writers. And Dubravka Ugrešić talks a lot about it, and again, that resonates with me a lot. I completely agree with her. We need to kind of stop making these kind of separations and describing.
Absolutely. In relation to talking about how to read her, how I read her, this is not a completely formed idea, but it's something that was coming to mind as you were talking, that part of like the idea of living in exile and having like things stripped away and using a different language, either as freedom or as something else, sort of speaks to me a bit in thinking about her books, and particularly the way that like the language and reality interplay. I'm thinking of like Lend Me Your Character in particular, and the stories that are in there. And there's a lot in Dubravka's books, like you mentioned Baba Yaga, but there's a lot of fairy tales, and there's a lot of fairy tale structures. And so a lot of times I see her books as being more kind of in the Russian formalist way. I've actually been reading reading a new translation of Victor Shklovsky's On the Theory of Prose. And there's a lot of things in there about like how plots are constructed, or how books use these certain like techniques that I see in Dubravka's books. Like they're not classic in that classic way. They're just engaged with a very like intelligent way of looking at form and content, and that there are all the themes that you're talking about that resonate and that work and like give the book a certain like meat to it and a sense to it, and then underlying it is this really interesting way of constructing things and of like using that kind of rule of threes with fairy tales of like playing around with these ideas and subverting them, and like really truly subverting the what we're talking about in terms of like the male author versus the female author, or whatever ways that works, and the way that men have kind of ruined everything in so many different ways. But she subverts that and upends it in such interesting ways, and like estranges things and makes them unique. And I think that that's the way that I've always approached it, is that she's writing from like a place of like pure genius, and like there's not very many people who see structure and form in the way quite that she does and is able to commit it. The other thing though that we haven't mentioned really at all, as we talk about like trauma and nostalgia, which are also very big issues in all of her work, is the humor of it. And one of the things that's like most like impressive is the way that in so many of these of the essay books in particular, thank you for not reading through Age of Skin, is that they are very sharp. There's a critique, a level of critique of like society or societal aspects or ways that things are prejudiced or just like assumed to be a certain way, and really takes that apart. And sometimes it's just spot on. Like I remember like all the sections and thank you for not reading, about booksellers and editors and people like that are like so close to the bone of like what really things are like, but at the same time they're funny in a way that like you don't feel offended. And there's something about that high wire act in her writing where it's like able to critique and yet you're always on her side. And I think that she uses humor in a way to like make that work, but it's something that's like endlessly impressive to me of how to be able to do that, where it doesn't devolve into like snarkiness or just bitterness. It has like real meaning with a sense of humor, and with the sense that like you're part of this, you're all in this together.
Yes, that's really interesting what you're saying, because I remember, reading, I think it was in Karaoke Culture, but in a few other books as well. She'll give kind of examples of kind of cultural phenomena. She will talk about, she will give example from Bulgarian culture, and just kind of the moment that you start feeling almost offended by it, you see, as you say, you see kind of the pure humor of that, and that's it really. That's kind of the reality. There's no reason to be offended, especially if you don't really feel part of that culture anyway, regardless of identity and national borders, etc. So yeah, I think I found kind of the very similar way. I found her kind of humor, but then also way of depicting reality really striking. And also what struck me was the fact that sometimes even now when I was preparing for this talk, I was going through her books and I've forgotten which one was fiction and which one was non-fiction. In a way, it's although some of the books are clearly labeled as fiction, there's kind of the way that she narrates, what she's talking about, her stories, using these kind of non-fiction elements or ways of kind of describing, I can probably classify as more kind of non-fiction. And I remember when I was working with Georgi Gospodinov, who is my editor for the Bulgarian version of 4 Minutes, he was saying, some kind of the early drafts, he was saying, there are kind of areas of your work that feels more like non-fiction. You have to kind of go back and, make it more as a story. And I did. And now reading Dubravka again, kind of rereading her, makes me think, obviously he had his point, but, I can see a clearly good example in Dubravka's books where she can really naturally use that sort of non-fiction in her fiction books that blend so well, that doesn't feel awkward. But I guess kind of a hybrid genre is always risky from a publishing point of view. And, she can afford to do that. Me as a debut writer probably never could.
I guess it's risky, but it's unfortunate that it is, because like that sort of nonfiction, the essayistic style that can get embedded in there through the characters is really effective and really interesting way to like construct a story. And that's one other thing, like talking about the form a lot, but like the way that like Fox is like put together, it's so playful, and the construction is also like so intricate, like on a Nabokov type level at times, where you're like, this little threads get connected in a way that's like incredibly rewarding when you see it. We did a whole 2-month review, our podcast, weekly podcast, where we talk about like one book for 2 months essentially. We did one of those on Fox, and it was like unbelievable to read it for like the third or fourth time and find new little connective tissues that go from one part of the book to another. And some of that gets like either exposed or sort of obscured by the more essayistic parts, and that makes it very fun. It's a very multi whatever, variance is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, like a multimodal sort of book, or polymodal sort of book. And I think that like it reminds me a bit too of like Robert Musil and of like the more classic sort of writers that I'm sure Dubravka loves or has read or is familiar with at the least. And like those books that weren't explicitly said, like, this is what fiction is supposed to be. This is what fiction has to be like this. But we're like exploring ideas of like, what can you incorporate into a book and make this book function? That sort of playfulness and like adventureness that comes through in her work a lot. And I think that that's a really fun aspect of being able to read Dubravka. And people shouldn't be afraid of that. I mean, publishers should just be doing what works best for the writer's voice, not what they think should be there. This isn't, to steal from Thank You for Not Reading, this isn't like social realism. Like we can have play, we can have fun, we can have different things that work and learn from that, instead of trying to make everything a cookie cutter, like XYZ, plots work like this is like that, all of that stuff. No, this is again how she's an influencer on me as a publisher. So I reject all of that. Speaking of real quick, we do have some time left, but if you have a question, please enter it in the question and answer box, and we can bring it up on here.
Yeah. You mentioned that while we're waiting for any questions, but you've published some of her books kind of in English for the first time. You have also republished American Fictionary. What's next? I'm curious to know.
The next two are a reissue of Thank You for Not Reading, and then a reissue of Lend Me Your Character, which were both the two books that we did at Dalkey when I was working there. And now we'll be able to have under the Open Letter house, and have there'll be 8 of her books that we have here, including Nobody's Home. All the ones we've mentioned. Nobody's Home is, I think, is the one, and Europe and Sepia are the 2 that we haven't brought up yet directly, but that way we'll have all 8 of these books all in the row, and hopefully at some point we can do all of the books. There's also oh god, I'm blanking out, Culture of Lies, which we'll be able to do as well after we do these 2, and like that way we'll be able to continue to bring in her backlist, and anything new that she writes, we would love to publish that as through Open Letter as well. Amazing. She's the foundational author of the press. The very first book we published was Nobody's Home, and she has more books than any other author on our list, and is very much like a defining sort of figure for what Open Letter titles mean, or what they are grouped together as. So it's a great honor to work with her.
And it's kind of great to see, to see her kind of development as a writer as well over the years. I mean, as I mentioned, the Age of Skin is the only one that I don't have, but how would you describe it to compare to others? How do you see Dubravka as a writer over the years? I know that she has published some 3 probably children's books before she started writing essays, kind of writing for adults. So for me, that shift itself was interesting and curious, but I also see some sort of a kind of thematic development of her as a writer as well, and exploring different things over the years, obviously that feel really close to her at the time. But how do you see her kind of development as a writer, and especially if you focus on the Age of Skin, which I can't comment on?
The Age of Skin, which we have here, which won an awards for its design, or got mentioned number of times for the design of the cover, which is a very cool thing to have happen. I was looking because I have 2 of her books, illustrated books, here somewhere, but they're on my very messy desk, and I'm not sure where they are on my very messy desk. So I'm gonna have to drop that for now. Age of Skin, I think that a lot of the themes that Dubravka has worked with over the years still maintain. There's like a baseline, that idea of exile, of being of nationalism as a problem, of like how you deal with nostalgia, both like the sort of nostalgic feelings, but also like the way that can sort of be baggage that might not be helpful to you. A lot of those things, and the role of like a female writer within society, within culture, and also like the way that culture values things. Those things I don't think have changed. With Age of Skin, what I think is maybe more developed is that it is more from a point of view, it's not as like incendiary or as necessarily as like taking down a certain thing, but really reflective and very like mature in a sense about like space and the ways that things connect. Like one thing that has developed over the years, there's always like used multiple like kind of ideas within the essays that kind of bounce off one another or like interlock. But I think that's even more pronounced in the Age of Skin, with different elements, different images, different things kind of coming together and creating a more like a bigger idea without having to be so explicit. Like it's not that she was ever like super hitting you over the head with things, but it's less explicit here, more subtle, more intuitive in that way. And I think it just reads like, it seems weird to say this, but like a more mature work, like a more build out, more confident work than ever. Not that any of the other books aren't. It's just like if you're asking to compare them, it's like an increase to where this is like really working like top level amazingness. Like every book, when we get like the new essays, it's always such a joy to like read and see where Dubravka is now. And like it feels both very comfortable, like you feel like this is her voice, which is another thing worth noting, is that even though there have been a number of translators that have worked on these books, there is like a consistent voice to them, a consistent point of view, consistent a sound and rhythm. And that's pretty unique. And that's a testament to me of like an author who is world class, is that when you have like a recognizable sort of voice that we can start reading and be like, yes, okay, I love this. I'm back with Dubravka, listening to her talk about this part of the world, of Europe, of what's going on, of immigration, of everything. And each time it's like a little bit more, it's a little bit smarter, it's a little more complicated, it's a little bit more nuanced every time. So it's like, it's just a really great ride. Like I recommend to anyone that's watching this that hasn't read her books, just read as many as you can. Like just read them through. You're not going to get bored. They're all very different. They're all very like interesting and compelling in their different ways. And like you say, like some are fiction, some are essays, but they sort of cross and straddle these lines and are just more like books. Like if we could say like, you don't want to be a Croatian writer, you don't even need to categorize. They're works of literature.
Writer that writes books.
They are literature, period. Yes. Big Al.
That's so true. And actually, you're saying, there are different translators, and you always kind of, for the different books, and you always kind of get that a kind of voice, her voice. There's even one book, Baba Yaga laid an egg, where all the three parts are translated by different translators. And I was rereading that recently, and I was thinking, you can never think that they are translated by different people, just the way that, the voice is unified. It's just amazing, really.
And the voice is unified, yet the form is also very different for those three. I crack up at like that the last part of that, where like the manuscript's turned into the publisher and they're like, this is too long. It was supposed to be like a short little thing. So you do have a couple of questions real quick. One from Elizabeth Kostova herself. She says, a question for you, Natalia. Do you imagine what Ugrešić's influence will be on you in the future?
Oh, interesting question. Thank you so much for the question. Probably kind of the first thing I need to say is that the way she influenced me for writing my first book, for example, and the way that I read her those kind of 20 or 10 years ago, it's very different to how, I reread her books right now. And I guess, being kind of close to kind of reliving my kind of emigration felt much stronger in the early years than it is, for example, now. So although kind of they still resonate with me as themes, I guess on a very kind of close emotional level, they were really influencing me much more kind of with, in kind of in the first years after reading them than now. But something that I didn't mention, for example, it's another influence that I guess it might be something that I want to develop even further. We talked about mythical figures and kind of from Slavic culture and Baba Yaga, something that I kind of mentioned in my book Arrival, and I use this kind of retelling of Samodevi, the kind of Bulgarian mystical beings that kind of empower, that kind of embody the female power and kind of idea for being independent as a woman, not being kind of, I guess, kind of almost kind of expected to only live in a home environment, and kind of be a wife, be a mother, etc., but have your own kind of expression of your female identity, whatever that identity is. So that kind of retellings are quite interesting for me. And as you're saying, she uses that really embedded as a way of telling, metaphorically kind of telling stories. So for example, in Baba Yaga Laid an Egg, she really kind of talks about the mother-daughter relationship, kind of the aging and how that's perceived. And she uses that figure of Baba Yaga as a way of telling that. And I don't think that I've done something completely the same with the Samodevi. It's almost kind of a story that kind of goes in parallel, but that's something that I feel very curious about kind of exploring more. So that might be one aspect that that her book kind of impacts my writing in future. I don't know. I still haven't started my third book, so it's kind of difficult to say.
Well, here's a question for you that's maybe the toughest one. If you were to choose one book that captures the quintessential Dubravka Ugrešić, which one would you choose?
For me, kind of the first one that I read, Maritime Fictionary, is kind of the one that I always go back to. And that's, for me, is kind of the foundation of, this for me is Dubravka Ugrešić, and always will be.
It's interesting. I'm going to go with Fox, just because I think Fox incorporates a lot of what we've been talking about in a really interesting and fun way. And also, if you are going to read it, you can also find our podcast wherever you get your podcasts and follow along. So, and it was really fun to dig into her work on that level. So I have a special affinity for this book for having spent so long inhabiting it. But God, Karaoke Culture is another one. Thank You for Not Reading. Museum of Unconditional Surrender is amazing.
All of them.
Come on, they're all good. They're all really, really, really good.
Yeah.
Is there any other question that anyone has? I see that there is a comment in which, in one of her books, Dubravka mentions that her mom came from Varna, which made her feel even closer to us, which is a really nice sentiment to Sophie.
Yes, I mean, I try to read, generally speaking, I try to read books kind of taking away the author's identity from the text. So, much like effectively kind of perceiving the text as a text. But you can't ignore the fact that when you are Bulgarian yourself, and you kind of see that mention of Varna as a city that you're too familiar with, that's just as I mentioned earlier, it kind of brings you much closer and kind of creates these bridges to home, especially if you're not at home at the moment. So yes, I agree with you, Sophie. That's a nice thing to hear.
It is fun too. I know we're just about out of time, but one thing that's interesting that you just kind of hit upon that we didn't really talk about either is the sort of slippery, we did a little bit, the slippery slope between fiction and nonfiction, but really that runs throughout her work, where things feel as if she's telling you from her real life, but they aren't, or maybe are, or kind of are. And it's not like the traditional sense of autofiction today, where it's here's what I am, here's what I did, and I based in more identity, but much more of a genuineness that's so true that it doesn't matter if the facts are right or if they line up, but there is something real there. And I know in Fox, there's a lot of play with that, of things that are happened and didn't happen sort of idea. And that's a really fun experience too, and gives you a sense of like you say, you don't want to read the author's life into their works. That's a very dangerous thing to end up doing. At the same time, you feel like you know this narrator in a way that's like that kind of crosses the books and crosses like the different things and feels like a real person, like the old like Salinger someone that you'd want to call after you finish the book sort of feeling, or like email them through their website and after you finish reading their book. And there is that, and it is a sense of genuineness and directness that makes it really compelling.
Yes, I mean, she does kind of not criticize, but I don't think that she likes kind of the genre of memoirs and autofiction, and you know, kind of, I think that's kind of too kind of direct and too kind of me as a kind of style for her. But I was thinking about it, and that's probably one thing that I not necessarily agree with her on, because reading her books, I felt that, you know, in a lot of cases, as you say, they feel like a memoir, just not being kind of classed as memoir, because they come from her personal experience. And I think kind of the genre of memoir is kind of redefined in recent years, and you don't, it's not a kind of a diary type of style necessarily. You know, it has kind of moved on a lot from that kind of personal experience, that it's so the kind of puts the kind of the person in the middle of the memoir. It's more kind of the story, and it's more kind of the, let's say, the social act of, you know, saying, you know, kind of telling about something, that it's important and kind of resonates on a much kind of wider scale, and not just a story of a particular person. I mean, I'll probably kind of exclude the kind of the celebrity autobiographies and memoirs, but, you know, when they're talking about serious literature, non-narrative fiction, I think I can probably read some of her books almost as a memoir for me.
Yeah. And I know that we are right up against our last minute. So I want to thank everyone here for attending and for watching this. And be sure and check out the Facebook page for the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation for the next 3 events that are taking place in this series. And I believe that you can see all the other ones there, and from that have had passed that have been recorded as well. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Natalia, so much for your great presentation.
Thank you for me as well.
Very fun.
It was such a pleasure to talk to you about Dubravka, Ugrešić, and thank you so much for you know, speaking to me, and Milena and everyone else, and the lovely translators that are kind of stay behind the scenes. Thank you so much for your work as well.
Sorry we talk so fast.